Welcome to day 29 of Shadowhunters month, and I can't believe it's a penultimate day already. Crazy. This is my fifth and final book club video, and it is, of course, on the Bane Chronicles, which is the series of technically 11, but like 10 main entries. A series of like 10/11 kind of anthology stories, all, of course, revolving around Magnus Bane. That was, was it 2013 and 2014? I think it's released around then. It certainly came out in paperback in like 2014, I think. And it kind of details loads of different events in Magnus's life, because obviously he's this ancient warlock. So of course, if they were going to do like an anthology series of stories, it made perfect sense for them to all focus on Magnus, because we've seen, you know, a bit of his life in the Mortal Instruments and the Infernal Devices, but this gave us a chance to see a lot more about what happened throughout his life, because obviously we see loads of different kind of time periods and stories set, you know, centuries apart throughout the Bane Chronicles, and it's just great to kind of get loads of more information about Magnus and a bit more about him and the things he'd done in the past before we first met him in the Mortal Instruments series. So I love that they made the choice to make these collections of short stories to fill in a lot of the gaps. Obviously we still know barely anything about what Magnus has done over the years, but I really like that we had some stories given to us, some that had been hinted before. You know, Magnus kind of mentioned before, I think, that he was banned from Peru, and the first story kind of centres around why that could be. And then there's some other things where we see their relationships established for the first time, or we revisit relationships that we've come to know and appreciate. And I love the idea and the choice to go with the Bane Chronicles. Really interesting. It took me a while to read it, actually. It did take me a bit of a time to kind of really get going into it, because I feel like sometimes the stories were a bit too long, but I don't think there's any entry I would say is a weak entry in the Bane Chronicles, which is quite the achievement, really. But I really love the whole idea behind the Bane Chronicles. So I've got some notes, and without further ado, let's just crack right into it with the first story which came out, which is called What Really Happened in Peru. I really like how this story, straight from the off, kind of really represented the playful side of Magnus as a character, because we get a few stories and then he's like, but that's not why I was banned. And I really like the idea that the Bane Chronicles kind of all came together to kind of almost be written by Magnus to give to Alex so we could get to know him better. I believe that's said somewhere that he did that, and I really like that we have like a reason for these stories actually being told now. I think that's really cool. But yeah, we start the first story in 1791, and Magnus and Ragnar fell. Love that we're seeing more of Ragnar and Katarina as well throughout the Bane Chronicles, because I love those two characters and I'm so happy to get to see more of them and the dynamic between the three of them in this. So we saw Magnus and Ragnar kind of touring Lima in Peru, you know, going sightseeing, stuff like that. A whole load of trouble going down. They get a tour of like the rainforest where Magnus is chased by like a spider monkey, so there's a lot of humour injected in some of these stories. Some of them are more serious and quite heavy topics addressed, but every now and then that is cut away with like quite a humorous story, which I think was a really smart choice. And then eventually Magnus is hired to guard like a cargo ship, which ends up with Magnus and Ragnar, mainly due to Magnus's carelessness, being kind of covered in bird droppings. Quite a humorous thing, and I just love this establishment of Magnus and Ragnar's friendship, and we really kind of see the effect that Ragnar's passing then ultimately has on Magnus in the Mortal Instruments. And then of course Magnus sinks that boat he was on, and we're thinking, okay, as we're reading it, okay, so that's why he was banned from Peru. That's quite interesting, and a really funny story behind that. And then it's like, but that's not actually why Magnus was banned. So you kind of, okay, let's keep reading. I like that kind of, not even a trope, it's not really a trope, but narrative playfulness, I suppose, to kind of really keep you engaged and interested. And they're not like dragging out one whole story for why Magnus was banned from Peru. They're just offering loads of short, snappy, really fun kind of ideas So even if it's like one short story, we're getting quite a few little events within it, and I really like that approach. Then we go to 1885, where Magnus, Ragnar and Katarina are all together in Peru, and like touring some pyramids, because this client of theirs wants to find the treasure of their great-great-grandmother, but then there's loads of kind of different reasons for what she was trying to find, because it turned out she'd kind of been taken by fairies at some point or something like that. And then they kind of ended up being branded as criminals for desecrating this ancient temple. And you think, okay, so that's why he's banned from Peru. But again, it's not. And Katarina makes a really cool decision, asking them all to stay in Peru for a bit, and Magnus and Ragnar agree to do that. And I like seeing Magnus kind of put in loads of different locations around the world, because we're so used to him being settled in New York. It's kind of cool seeing him living in other places. Then 1890, we skip ahead again, 5 years. Magnus, it's quite a humorous story really. Magnus is trying to take up a musical instrument, trying to be a bit of a musician, and he strikes up a relationship with the local musician, which ultimately doesn't quite work out. Because the guy thinks that Magnus won't stick around very long, and obviously we know the irony in that, because Magnus is immortal. Which again goes on to be a problem with Magnus and Annik's relationship, so that's kind of cool. And yeah, we get a few childhood stories through this, through Magnus kind of opening up to this guy, which was really cool. And when that relationship kind of fizzles out, Magnus decides to take up dancing instead, but he uses magic to be really good at it, and we see him go through quite a lot of drunken, humorous antics at Ragnar and Katarina's expense. So I really like seeing that really playful side of Magnus again. Kind of like young naivety, I suppose, because obviously this took place a long time ago. So I liked that. And then those three kind of get to share in their life stories as well, which I really like, getting insight into these three like ancient warlocks. And, you know, we kind of get some hints about Magnus's father and how he's not just that standard demon, and I really like that. It was a really good kind of character study, this first story, but there's also a lot of really playful elements in there. And then we skip ahead to 1962 for the final kind of chapter, and Magnus kind of starts a fleeting summer romance with this mundane called Kitty. They go on like a life of crime together, and then through various of their crimes he gets a letter from the High Council of Warlocks saying that he's been banned from Peru. So we kind of get the answer for that, but they never specify exactly what he did to get banned, and we never know, and I really like that. So we know the circumstances of him getting banned, but we don't know exactly what got him banned, and Magnus doesn't even know either. So I really like that, and the fact that it's called What Really Happened in Peru. And we never actually get the proper answer to why he got banned. I really thought that was a clever way of going about that first story. Really fun, really funny introduction to the Bane Chronicles. I thought it was a really, really great first entry. Then we move on to The Runaway Queen, with the second story, and it's set in Paris, and Magnus is touring Paris, and he runs into Marcel St. Cloud, that's it, who kind of is a head of a vampire clan in Paris, and invites him to this party. And then Magnus is asked by a guy called Axel to save the French royal family, and through various different circumstances, their kind of rescue mission has to take place on the same night as the party, so Magnus is kind of torn between both events, and he has to focus on both things, which is quite an interesting dilemma to put him through. I really liked that. And then he manages to sneak the royal family out, but a rogue vampire, I think, finds the queen, and then St. Cloud wants to buy her, so Magnus has to come up with this complete lie over who exactly this woman is, and that he's working on a glamour for her, but he's not finished yet, so when he's finished, then he can buy her. So again, they get locked into a room, so they can't really escape, but Magnus uses his magic to summon a hot air balloon that he was going to go on earlier in the story, over to their window, so he and the queen can escape. And I really like that whole idea of that sequence, Magnus escaping by balloon. What a Magnus way to make his exit. I love that. Then sometime later, Axel's sister Sophie sends him a letter, talking about how the family were kind of all captured anyway and returned. but Axel intends on returning to Paris to kind of go through and finish the plan and his mission, which would put his life in danger, and asks Magnus to write a letter to him to kind of stop him doing that and stop him risking his life for something that he believes in so much. And then Magnus kind of writes a letter and takes his time to think about it, and then ultimately decides to burn it, which I think is a very interesting character choice, and I really like that we kind of ended what was almost a light-hearted-ish story on kind of a very serious note, which is very truthful to Magnus as a character, because he can be this really extravagant, flamboyant, funny character, but when it gets down to business, you don't want to mess with him. So I liked that. It's not my favourite story in the Bane Chronicles by any means, but it's kind of a neat little addition, and I like the whole kind of Paris backdrop as well. Then the third story is called Vampires, Scones and Edmund Herondale, or Scones, if that's how you say it. I say Scones. And there's this meeting with the consul in the London Institute, which Magnus attends, and we see him kind of become properly acquainted with Camille for the first time, which is kind of a really cool moment to finally see. We also get some really serious hints of, I suppose, racism against downworlders, because people in the Institute were throwing away any plates that downworlders have eaten off of, which is just awful, really. But I love that kind of theme throughout the Shadowhunters books, like this racism, basically. So we got kind of glimpses of that, and at the same time we're introduced to Edmund Herondale, who Magnus runs into, and it reminds him of Will, I think he must be, because it's a Herondale. And I really like that. Bringing the Herondales back into it, and another Herondale, giving him some focus, I think is really, really cool. And then Edmund and Magnus together kind of save these two girls called Lynette and Angarad, and previously Edmund had mentioned that he'd never actually fallen in love before, and probably and kind of accepted that he wouldn't. But then ultimately him and Lynette fall in love, and he considers leaving the Shadowhunter life behind to be with her properly. And Magnus kind of wishes him love and wishes him luck on that journey. And we're also introduced to Ralph Scott, who's like a werewolf. There seems to be some tension with him and Camille during these meetings in the London Institute. And there's a dealing attack on the Institute, which causes lots of people to be killed on all sides. And we kind of see the origins then of the werewolves kind of backing away from the Shadowhunters and the Clave and everything, saying we'll just handle ourselves, which we kind of later see when the Molten Strunts begins. So I like the origins of that whole thing. And we kind of find out that Camille and Ralph are kind of been having an on-off kind of romance thing, and Magnus encourages Camille to kind of give Ralph another chance with her love, even though he's very attracted to her, and she clearly has feelings for him as well. And they show a kiss, and he gives Camille a ruby necklace so she doesn't forget him, and that if it doesn't work out, maybe she can find him one day. So we kind of saw the origins of their romance, which I really enjoyed. And at the same time as that, Magnus overhears some screaming in agony and everything, and we find out the ceremony is being taken for Edmund to have his marks removed because he's chosen to leave the Shadow World behind and get married because he's fallen in love. So I like that display of the brutality of leaving the Shadow World behind, and just how much people have to lose and the cost of love in the Shadow World. So I really liked how this story particularly highlighted that. So I really enjoyed that story. Then we come to the fourth one, The Midnight Heir, which is one of my favourite stories in the Bane Chronicles. And if you've seen some of my previous Shadowhunters videos, you probably know why, because of who appears in it. And it's again set in London. Magnus is in London currently. He's on a business trip because Tatiana Blackthorn has something for him to do. But ultimately he finds out that she wants to have him kill 5 Shadowhunters, so he says he's not going to do that. And I really like getting more of a glimpse into Magnus's moral code and everything, so I really like that aspect of things. And then in a club in London, Magnus sees James Herondale causing a bit of a drunken mess, because he's doing loads of dares for things, and just being an absolute nuisance basically. And because of Magnus's ties to Will and the Herondale family, he kind of feels compelled to help him out, so he goes on this like wild goose chase with James throughout all of London. And then we find out that James has inherited powers, much like Tessa had, his mother. Because obviously he's the son of Tessa and Will from the Infernal Devices, two people I love very much. So I liked seeing that kind of revelation that James has powers and abilities too, which I hope they can explore a lot in the last hours when those come out. Very exciting. And then Magnus returns James, once he catches up to him, to Tess and Will. And I think it's 25 years since he's seen them at this point. So Will is very much looking quite older. And I really like kind of seeing little tease of the last hours, I suppose. Because we know this is kind of the time period that we're going to be dealing with when we get to those books. And of course Tessa is like a warlock, so she's aging very slowly. So she only looks like 2 or 3 years older in the 25 years that have passed. Let's get a glimpse of Brother Zachariah, of course, being Jem. So I love the revisitation of the Infernal Devices characters in this. I love that. And they just kind of briefly catch up, and I love that moment, highlighting those amazing relationships that were formed in the Infernal Devices. I just thought it was a beautiful use of characters in this book, and kind of exploring some parallels with James saying, while his father was cursed, he's damned, things like that. I really liked what they did with the characters in this particular story. Definitely one of my favourites. I absolutely adore it. And then we kind of get into quite an interesting kind of trilogy of stories, I suppose, throughout the Bane Chronicles, which in terms of like story structure and like a narrative, I think was very well done. And that kicks off with the 5th story, which is the rise of the Hotel du Mort, or du Mort, however you pronounce it. And it's set and highlights a very interesting kind of issue, which is the prohibition of alcohol in the USA when that all went down. And Magnus is kind of running his own bar at this time. But when that kind of gets shut down, he moves the after party to a hotel room, which then lots of people do end up staying and almost inhabiting that space with Magnus, because they just don't seem to want to leave. So that's kind of highlighting the party life of Magnus, but also the downsides of that kind of lifestyle. Almost as if he should settle down with a different Shadowhunter. And he also meets up with this guy called Aldous, Warlock, who is having visions of the end of the mundane world. And he's kind of warning Magnus to kind of get away while he still can. So very kind of bleak things that going on there, which was quite an interesting concept to explore, because normally it's like, oh, all of the shadow world has been threatened because they're the ones who are kind of protecting the mundane world. So the idea of the mundane world itself being the one that's being threatened is quite interesting. So I liked that, and how Magnus was kind of intrigued by all of that. And his investigations into it kind of lead him back to the Hotel du Mort. Although I think it's just called the Hotel du Mont or something at that point, because it's not actually that name. And we see that Aldous has kind of completely lost it. And he's like opened this portal where he believes leads to the home of all warlocks, where they should go to like escape the end and everything. And he has this ritual performed to get everything to work, and it's causing loads of destruction and damage. Then with the help from like a Shadowhunter, Magnus kind of manages to cut himself and uses his blood to seal the portal and the spell and everything. And there's kind of a cyclical nature to this story, because near the start, at his club, he met a vampire called Dolly, who was kind of warning him to leave New York, obviously because someone must have known about what was coming. And we revisit that at the end, and it's found out that Dolly was sent there by a friend of Magnus's, who in turn is then revealed to be Camille. So I really like how she was kind of brought back into the Bane Chronicles at that moment, because obviously we reach about the halfway point, and one of the major plots that are kind of explored in the Bane Chronicles is the relationship between Magnus and Camille, because that was kind of a big thing in the Mortal Instruments as well. So it was nice to see a lot more of that explored in this set of stories. So yeah, again, I don't think it's my favourite of the stories, but it was kind of had a lot of interesting ideas going for it. And again, those are funny moments with Magnus. He's kind of the king of the one-liners in the books, so I really liked that, seeing that side of him again. And then, well, it's not directly about like the Hotel du Mort. The sixth story is called Saving Rafael Santiago. So obviously we're introduced to a major player in terms of the Hotel du Mort, because obviously we know Raphael was kind of in charge of a lot of things at the time with the Mortal Instruments. And we see kind of the birth of his really strong connection to Magnus, which was hinted at in the Mortal Instruments. So again, having these gaps filled in, and as a book reader and a huge fan, it's like a real punch to the air moment. So we're seeing these kind of moments actually happen for the first time, and it's just really, really exciting. And I really like this story, what it does with Raphael as a character. Kind of makes you sympathise with him in a way you may not have in the Mortal Instruments, so I really like that. So basically, Raphael's mother comes to Magnus saying that her son has gone missing and might possibly be dead, and she wants Magnus to kind of help out. She thinks it has something to do with vampires because she's sort of aware of the shadow world, and that therefore leads Magnus to the hotel, where he sees this vampire sucking on a young boy and feeding on him, and he assumes the person being fed on is Raphael, but then it turns out the vampire doing the feeding was actually Raphael, and he has been turned into a vampire. And when Magnus brings up Raphael's mother, he kind of calms down quite a bit and realises he needs to kind of train himself to be able to say like words like God, or to hold his cross, just say like holy phrases and stuff, so he can kind of prepare and work himself better towards reuniting with his mother, because he realises that's what he wants. So Magnus really helps him through that, and they live together through this time, so we see them kind of getting to know each other a lot better and getting really, really close, which I love. I love how they explored that, and there's even a brief bit with Ragnar coming along, and he doesn't initially like Raphael at first, but then they become pretty good friends. We see the kind of birth of that, because I think that's mentioned in the Mortal Instruments, that Raphael had sent a letter to Ragnar at some point, and they were ultimately quite close. So I loved that kind of birth of that friendship as well being seen. And we see a really interesting process of Raphael continuing to train himself to kind of be better and to allow himself to see his mother again. And then we see foreshadowing of kind of Raphael's leadership role in terms of the vampires, when he kind of scares a few off from attacking a young girl, I think. So we just get a hint of the leadership role he would ultimately take, because those vampires were a lot older than him, but Raphael's confidence and everything kind of scared them away. So I liked that kind of foreshadowing. And then the story ends with Raphael reuniting with his mother. Really sweet kind of sequence. And Raphael's mother offers Magnus some money, but Magnus refuses it because he says that he didn't save Raphael like he promised to. Raphael saved himself, and I loved that. Really nice way to end that story. I thought it was really sweet. I just loved the whole exploration of family in that story, because, you know, Raphael physically had a family with his mother, but he also kind of found a family in Magnus and Ragnar as well. So I love that. Definitely one of the highlights of the Bane Chronicles for me, that story. I really, really enjoyed it. Then we kind of end this kind of Hotel du Mort origin story, if you will, with the trilogy, with the seventh story being the fall of the Hotel du Mort. And it's again set in New York. Magnus has just returned because he's been away travelling for 2 years. So he comes back to New York. He kind of has vampire squatters in his place, but they don't seem quite right. They seem quite sick, and vampires don't tend to get sick. So that kind of worries Magnus, and that foreshadows the main plot to come. As well as being on the plane, someone sat near him on the plane was clearly a drug addict and even offered him some. And that kind of is a foreshadowing of the events to come through the book, which I think was done very well. And we kind of learn that there's been a bit of a problem with vampires in New York, because they've been attacking and biting and feeding a lot more recently, and something is very wrong with all of them. And through his investigation, Magnus reunites with Camille, so we see her pop up again, which is really cool. And this has kind of been after their relationship had ended. and they kind of work out together that vampires had been feeding on drug addicts, and therefore they were becoming addicted to drugs themselves, and that was causing all this mysterious behaviour, which I think was a really interesting kind of thing to explore with the vampires, because normally we have the vampires and we have their victims, but the vampires ended up being kind of victimised by their own crimes, which I thought was a really interesting thing to do with them. So I love that, and things really escalate when there's a blackout in New York, which sends the vampires into even more of a crazy, and there's loads of crime and everything. Magnus and Camille come up with this plan. Well, Magnus more so forces the plan on Camille, because obviously she's not at her best. I like seeing him kind of take charge in that moment, and they like smash the bottles containing the dirt from the graves where all these vampires had been buried with it and risen from, in order to summon them, and they all get summoned to the hotel. And Magnus locks Camille and all the vampires in the hotel for 3 days, I think it is, until they kind of calm down from their drug addictions, and that kind of solves the problem. Raphael shows up as well and is revealed to kind of have been helping the sick, so I really liked that. It's nice seeing Raphael in the books who isn't like totally an arsehole. And following all these events, Magnus calls Katarina over and asks her to wipe his memories of the whole thing. So it's kind of nice seeing weakness and vulnerability there in Magnus, because he doesn't want to remember seeing Camille like that and everything. And you know, she does the memory wipe, and Magnus forgets the events, and when he's questioned about Camille, he mentions that he hasn't seen him in 80 years. So it's kind of a sad, kind of bittersweet end to that story. But I really like what they did in terms of plot with that story. I think it was really interesting, and a lot of cool character moments as well, especially because it showed a more vulnerable side to Magnus that we hadn't really got before in the Bane Chronicles, except for when there were brief mentions of Magnus's father. And then I feel like this is probably more of a fan favourite one, the 8th story, because it's called What to Buy the Shadowhunter Who Has Everything, and then in brackets, and who you're not officially dating anyway. Very Magnus-y kind of title to that story, I think, because Magnus has kind of got two big problems going on, and one of them is being that he has a client who's annoying him and wants him to summon the demon, and ultimately what she wants the demon to do when he's been summoned is do something that Magnus could have done himself anyway. She's kind of really irritated by that, and that's kind of a huge deal, summoning a demon and everything, but his mind is more kind of taken and frustrated with buying Alec a birthday present, and I really like that. Very kind of human and mundane dilemma. I thought that was really interesting to do that with a character like Magnus, and you know, even after all his years, he still is kind of clueless and puzzled on things. Because obviously he doesn't really know Alec all too well at that moment. And he's trying to come up with like ideas for this gift, and he really can't do it. He even calls Ragnar and Katarina, who both hang up on him because they just can't be doing with that. And I really like sometimes seeing Katarina and Ragnar just be like, I'm not dealing with your shit today, Magnus. I do understand that he'd probably be quite a lot, but we love him anyway. That is why we love Magnus. And then he ultimately gets a visit from Isabel, and I loved her showing up. That was so cool, because she's one of my favourite characters. And she kind of says that she's cool with Magnus and Alec being a thing, which I thought was really sweet. And in that moment, Magnus realises that what he can do for Alec and what he can give Alec as a gift, because he knows how much he cares about his sister, probably more than anyone, and therefore kind of puts a spell on Isabel's whip to make sure that it would never fail her when she needs it, which I think was really sweet and a really cool kind of resolution to that problem that Magnus had been facing throughout the story. We also get a few more glimpses about Magnus's tricky past with his father, because the demon that he'd summoned for his client kind of taunts him about Asmodeus, and Magnus quickly kind of sends it back and banishes it again. So again, more kind of a vulnerable side of Magnus, as well as the vulnerability of him being confused over what to do about Alec's present. And then get a really sweet kind of moment at the end where Alec comes over, and you know, they kiss, and Magnus wishes him a happy birthday, and it's a really sweet kind of ending to a story, and I do really like that story a lot. It was interesting kind of see a more mundane dilemma, I suppose, for Magnus to deal with, because you know he can like cast spells and fight vampires and close portals and stuff, but I think everyone can relate to not having any ideas for what to buy someone for a birthday present. So I loved what that story did. Then we get to the 9th story, which is The Last Stand of the New York Institute, which tackles some really heavy stuff. This is where the shit really hits the fan, really, with the Bane Chronicles, because we kind of see the origin of the Valentine and the Circle coming to New York, and Magnus getting caught up with them. But we also have kind of serious theme of HIV and AIDS at the start, because Katarina's kind of working at a clinic, and Magnus is kind of attacked and berated and bullied for his appearance by this random guy, and he refuses Katarina's touch when she kind of helps him out, because, you know, she's been touching people with HIV and he thinks it's contagious and stuff. So there's some real world issues going on throughout like the fantasy series of stories, which I think is really cool. Very well done, and I like how they explored that in this story. Yeah, and then we see kind of the origins of the Circle come to New York, which I thought was really cool. I love that moment. And there's this huge kind of battle with like Stephen Herondale, Robert and Maris Lightwood, Jocelyn, Luke. Seeing them all younger was really, really cool as well, and seeing just how much they were kind of sheep to Valentine. And Magnus even says like he almost feels sorry for them, because they completely are dependent on Valentine and his ideals. But we also see some really cool origins of Luke, or Lucian at the time, kind of starting to doubt Valentine and turning his back on him, because Valentine is torturing this young, well, basically a little girl, this werewolf, putting silver coins on her eyes and everything, and ends up blinding her. And seeing Magnus completely enraged by that and completely lose control at that was a really cool side to the character, which I don't think we've explored nearly enough, so I loved seeing that. And you know, Luke was absolutely horrified by what Valentine had done to that werewolf girl, and we see a lot of doubt form from him in that moment. So I love the origins of that and the cracks in that relationship beginning to form. And even in that moment, Magnus comments to himself like he wondered why he ever disliked Luke, and I liked that. And how they explore the aftermath of that whole attack and everything, and the devastation that it caused. And then we skip ahead a bit, and Tessa pops up again, which is awesome, and her and Magnus are watching Pride and Prejudice, I think, in his place, and then suddenly we get some more kind of Mortal Instruments connections, because they are approached by a woman and her child, who's revealed to be Jocelyn. And we get kind of the first instinct of Jocelyn asking Magnus, and also Tessa, to remove Clary's sight, to protect her, so she can grow up without having to know the shadow world to protect her. So we kind of see the Mortal Instruments truly begin with this story, and I thought that was a really cool way to end it. And seeing how Jocelyn came up with the name Frey, like Fairchild and Grey coming together, Tessa agreeing to help out and convincing Magnus to help out as well with that, because Tessa is such a sweet, gentle soul, and I love her. You know, and she says they can go to the Silent City and do the ceremony and everything, because she knows a silent brother who can keep a secret, obviously referring to Jem. So I love that. I love the kind of info dump this story particularly gave us, and seeing some of these characters who were adults in the Mortal Instruments be a bit younger and more naive. Seeing Lucian begin to doubt Valentine, seeing Tessa again, seeing Jocelyn come with baby Clary, and seeing that moment Magnus agrees to help them and everything. We got loads of kind of Mortal Instruments tie-ins with that series, and it was really, really great for book fans to kind of get some more details and gaps filled in and see all these amazing moments happen. I loved it so much. And then we get to probably another fan favourite story, because it's a Malik focused one again. So the 10th story is called The Course of True Love, and First Dates. And obviously it centres around Malik's first date, and both of them are extremely nervous about it, because it takes place 3 days after, I think, when they first agreed to go out, and their first kiss as well, which is another short story that you can read online. You know, Alec arrives late. Magnus thinks he's been stood up, but then Malik arrives because he's been training. Alec arrives, not Malik. Alec arrives late because he'd been training with Jace, and he's really nervous. He spills Magnus's wine all over the place. On the way to like the restaurant they're going to, there's this really awkward train journey with everything. All these people like wishing them luck. This guy kind of playing awful music on the train, and they're not sure whether or not they should laugh at it because they wouldn't know how the other one's going to react. So there's a real awkwardness and a barrier there between them. And when they get to the restaurant, Magnus's kind of ex-conquest, if you will, warns Alec off him and warns him that Magnus will break his heart. So there's a lot of tension there, a lot of awkwardness, and Magnus had already kind of arranged with Katarina that she should call him and fake an emergency so he can get out of the date if he needs to. So he's going to go through with that. But it turns out Katarina called him with a genuine emergency involving like a werewolf kind of being loose. And he asks Alec to kind of help him sort that whole mess out. And Alec is surprised because he thought he was just kind of getting out of the date, but it turns out to be a real emergency. So they arrive at like this bar or something where this werewolf's loose, and it turns out to be quite a young girl who was in a relationship with another young downworlder. So they're kind of from different places, different races in a way, but they have this really loving relationship, which obviously is meant to be a reflection of what Magnus and Alec could have and eventually will have. And that helps really ease the tension between them, and they find a really mutual understanding following all of that. Because like Alec had been quite defensive of Magnus in that battle and trying to protect him and everything, which Magnus, I keep saying Malik to describe both of them. They basically are just Malik, aren't they? Which Magnus really liked. And they agreed to kind of go on another date. Even despite something inside of Magnus telling him maybe he shouldn't. You know, he is happy that he didn't kind of give up on the date like he was going to, and he wants to get to know Alec more. So they rearrange another date. And he kind of, Magnus notes that he hopes Alec won't break his heart, which we kind of see he actually kind of does in City of Lost Souls. So it's kind of a bittersweet ending to that. But it was a really cool seeing Malik go on their first date and see how awkward it was, but also kind of how sweet it was in the end. For such a fan favourite couple, I think you're well fed with that story, and it is really, really cool. And I really liked kind of seeing both of them vulnerable, because sometimes they're quite strong and sassy characters, but you don't really see them completely break or have a vulnerable side. So I liked how we got that with both of them in this story, and how they kind of made better characters for it. And then the bonus kind of chapter, I don't know if it's in, like, I don't think it was like released properly as a story because it's quite short, but the 11th story technically, in at least in this one, is called The Voicemail of Magnus Bane. And it's not like a properly written story, it's just a series of voicemail messages left on Magnus's phone, following him breaking up with Alec at the end of City of Lost Souls. So we see a few people kind of leave him messages. You know, Alec leaves him quite a few, Isabel leaves him one, Jace leaves him one, I think Clary leaves him one. Just kind of bridging the gap between City of Lost Souls and City of Heavenly Fire, and I really liked that. It's a really kind of heartbreaking way to end the Bane Chronicles, really. But it was really cool, and my personal favourite, being absolute Sizzy trash, was Simon's voice message to Magnus. He's kind of talking to him, and then you kind of hear Isabel hit him in the background, because obviously she's kind of looming over him and kind of obviously forced him into leaving this message. Just kind of a brief Sizzy interaction that I just completely melted over. But the kind of, for the story called The Bane Chronicles, the lack of like Magnus's presence in that story I think was really impactful, because he's kind of taken himself away from all these characters by breaking it with Alec. So it's kind of really heartbreaking behind all of that story, but I loved the way that was handled. I thought it was like a really nice little addition. And yeah, I thought it was a really kind of cool way to end the Bane Chronicles and bridge the gap between books 5 and 6, The Modern Instruments. But yeah, those are the stories that make up the Bane Chronicles. I think it's an amazing, amazing collection of stories. Loads of great character moments and character development for Magnus, loads of gaps being filled in, new stories we didn't know about. That was a lot of fun. There's some really kind of hard-hitting issues explored, like drug abuse and AIDS and everything. But also some really funny stories, some really sweet stories, and a lot of moments that fans are just really going to love. So I love the idea behind the Bane Chronicles, and all these stories are really, really cool. Seeing some characters from other series from Shadowhunters kind of brought into it. It's just great, because Magnus very much is the heart of Shadowhunters in many ways, because he's connected to so many different characters. So using him as a basis for these series of stories allows us to see more of the characters we love so much. So I love that he kind of got his own set of short stories, and will continue to do so, because we're getting like a Malik focused trilogy as well. I think that starts next year, the first one. So that's really cool. I think it's called The Red Scrolls of Magic or something, but I can't wait for that to come out. So yeah, some really, really great stories. I think some were a bit too long in some cases, but some are better than others. But I think that's kind of more of a personal thing. I really loved The Midnight Air. I really loved Saving Rafael Santiago and The Fall of the Hotel du Mort. Walked by the Shadowhunter Who Has Everything, The Course of True Love. I think there's some really, really great stories in there. That will please most people. I really love what they did with it. All the kind of flashbacks we were getting and everything. You definitely know a lot more about Magnus and a lot more about so many characters having read the Bane Chronicles. So it was definitely kind of a must read for me. I think it was a great character study. It's just a great time. And, having that trilogy in the middle with like the Hotel du Mort in chapters 5, 6 and 7. Really clever kind of narrative kind of choice. And because each chapter is kind of its own story, you don't feel the need to kind of rush through it, because it's not one long narrative. You're kind of going back and forwards in time throughout the whole thing. So there's no pressure when reading it, and it's just a lot of fun exploring a fan favourite character. What more could you want, basically? Yeah, that's the Bane Chronicles. I really, really love so many of the stories that we got given in them. And if you haven't checked them out, definitely do so, even though I've spoiled a few plot details. But I haven't mentioned absolutely everything that happens in every story, so there'd be a lot of surprises left for you if you haven't read them. But if you have, let me know what you think of the Bane Chronicles, what your favourite stories are in them, etc. And yeah, until the final day of Shadowhunters month tomorrow, thanks for watching.